join me in welcoming Samantha Appleton and Greg Rick.
We're going to be running the slideshow from this little device, so you know how technology is. I might have to get up and kickstart it. So I just want you to know, and I'm not making this up at all, you are actually sitting in the chair that Patrick
I wasn't going to ask, but...
No, there's actually an identifier on the back of the chair, and you are where he was just a short month ago.
I'll try to live up to it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming up from Boston and fitting us in. I know your orientation at Harvard has been pretty hectic, so thanks for coming up through this late August heat wave.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me. This is it's such a joy to be in this beautiful space. I never knew this space existed, so I appreciate you guys for having me.
Let me just say, in keeping with my own tradition in hosting these, I forgot my list of questions on the printer over at the office. So if you see me staring off into space, that's the reason why. And I think we'll come back around to it, but could you give us sort of like a brief summary of what you're doing down at Harvard as part of the Nieman Fellowship?
So for those of you that don't know, and I didn't until I started the large application process for it, the Nieman Fellowship is a mid-career journalism fellowship. And it really is like a dream. You get to take classes at Harvard, and you're part of a group of 24 people, like-minded individuals that all of them are incredible in their own way. There are documentary filmmakers, there's a TV anchor from Turkey, there's a media entrepreneur from Nigeria. And so all of us are thrown together and take seminars together and also take classes.
That's great.
Dream. It's a dream fellowship.
And we'll sort of we'll come back around to sort of where you hope to use what you're studying at Nieman and how you might apply it to your photography in the future. But what I'd like to do is sort of step back and go to the beginning, because for me, I'm always fascinated at how photographers become photographers, because it was my hobby, but I never dreamed of becoming a photojournalist until certain things clicked. And I know I've read you were, in high school, was more interested in being a foreign correspondent, but somewhere along the line, you got interested in photography.
Well, you know, one of the great things of growing up in Mid-Coast, Maine is now it's the Maine Media Workshops, at the time Maine Photographic Workshops. And a friend of mine was, her mom worked in the office, and she was an administrator, and basically got her daughter and I a free slot in the Young Photographers course. So we were like 13 years old with all of these 18-year-olds that were smoking, and you know, they threw us. The teacher would throw us in the back of his van, and we'd just drive all over photographing. That's really how I got into it, and that's just one of the. You know, at the time, it was one of the only workshops, photo workshops in the world. Now there's a million, but at the time it was very unique, and it's something. It was so homegrown in Maine, and it was a very uniquely Maine thing at the time, and I'm sure you experience this. You meet photographers all over the world. Oh, I took a course there, or I wanted to, or I taught there,
and so that was sort of the start.
That was the start of photography itself. Yeah.
And where did it go from there?
I started to. I don't know how or why, but I started to notice the New York Times, and I just became kind of obsessed with the New York Times itself, and you know what story was on the front page, and thought I was going to be a writer, but leaned and did both in college, in high school and college. I really had already started doing it, but I found that photography fit my personality better. I didn't like asking a lot of questions. I preferred the fly on the wall approach to it. So.
And where would you say, like, where did it suddenly click to you, like, I need to get serious about this?
It was always there.
Oh, okay.
I feel like I was like in my 30s when I was a teenager. I was like, I just always knew in some form I wanted I wanted to do it. So I can't say it was a moment, but
Okay.
I was always working toward it in some way.
Right. Yeah, I do think photojournalism is one of those professions that it doesn't just fall in your lap. You actually
Yes.
have to work at it, and it's about connections, and it's a slow process. I think of, like, in my mind, when I decided to become a photojournalist, really wasn't a photojournalist for another decade.
Yeah.
It's not an easy profession to break into.
And it's a deceptive medium because it's, especially now, but even when I was growing up, if you had access to a camera, I remember like your first photos, you think you're a genius, like
Yeah.
taking a picture of an apple like shallowed up the field, like, oh man, but I look back at that, it's so embarrassing. Like you don't realize how bad you are until you start to get better. But everybody thinks they can do it, and now with phones it's the same thing. Although photography the bar really is much higher now. But you think it's so easy. It's the same way since I've started to write and been working on this book. I have such empathy for writers now because I had that feeling of like, okay, I'm gonna write a book, and I was like, this is the same thing when a writer says to you, I'm gonna do a photo project. And you're like, good luck. Like,
Yeah.
talk to me in 10 years.
Yeah, I had, in college, I had the National Geographic photographer Randy Olson look over my portfolio. And that was sort of the moment for me because he came and he says, Greg, this is really excellent work, technically proficient. And I'm like, all right. And then he's like, but it just leaves me emotionally dry. I get no emotion from these photographs. And and he said,
Randy's a really nice guy.
Yeah, he is. And he says, quite frankly, I'm a bit bored. And it sounds terrible, but that's sort of that was my moment, like, oh, okay, I've really got to up my game. And so, yeah, that kind of criticism is actually important.
One of my scariest but best lessons as a professional photographer was I was working for the New Yorker, and I went to Afghanistan to take a portrait of Hamid Karzai. This is when the New Yorker could pay someone to go there. And, it took a while to get the access, and then we kind of worked on other things. And so I come back with my portrait of him, and Elizabeth Biondi, who's an incredible photo editor, but very intense German woman. And she I give her the film, and then you just kind of wait to hear. And she calls me up and she says, well, frankly, I'm a little bit disappointed. This is like, I went to Afghanistan, And she goes, this is how the conversation went. I'm a little bit disappointed. But then I started to look at every picture ever taken of Hamid Karzai, and this is like a lot, this is like 2005, 6. Every portrait ever taken of him, and yours is my favorite. Okay. But that's the kind of but Elizabeth, I worked my butt off for her because she was so harsh. And I mean, every harsh criticism that she gave me, I just fed off of, like you can despair, but then you're like, damn it, like I don't want to disappoint her,
Yeah. So let's move on to sort of the maybe the watershed moment of our generation, but also maybe where you came into your own as a photojournalist, and that's covering 9/11 down in New York City. And how did you end up deciding to head down to New York? Because you were in Maine at the time, right?
I had this is for if there are any young photographers out here, you'll make some bad decisions. President Bush had said that Latin America was going to be a big focus of his presidency. So I called the New York Times and said, where would be a good place to be based? And the editor said, we really could use someone in Mexico City. So I go down to Mexico City, summer of 2001, get an apartment, and I came back up to Maine to just get my stuff, basically. And I was supposed to fly out on the 12th. And so I was sitting up in Camden when it happened. And it just, I've written about this a little bit. And it really was just like, there was a moment where I practically said out loud, like, okay, this is what you've been training for and wanting to do, and it's in your backyard. And so I drove down like the crack of dawn the next morning and worked my way down to ground zero.
And this is where the photo starts, so bear with me.
He's not checking his text.
Yeah. My kids are not texting me. Okay. I was fearful I'd have to get up and chat with the laptop, and that's exactly what's happening.
Sleep.
Hey, it's working. Sweet. So we'll have images throughout. We won't talk about every single image. Some of them sort of just fit what the theme we're talking about. But this is from 9/11. And I don't know if you can see, but in the center of a frame, there is a person putting up a flag. You want to talk about this image a little bit?
Well, this is one of the very last images I took because I drove down at the crack of dawn on the 12th, and it took me all day to get into Ground Zero. And then when I went in, it was dark. It was probably about 8 or 9 at night, and I got into the scene, and I just spent all night photographing. And then around this time, at dawn, when new cops were coming in and I was more visible, they kicked me out. So this really was, that's kind of just what my remembrance of that really was. It's just one image of daylight, really. You can see the sun coming up.
Uh-oh, I might have to resort to the clicker. You know, the thing is, before the show, this was working perfectly fine.
It was working.
Yeah, it was seamless.
I'll just tell a quick story while I'm doing that. We were talking about, I took some pictures in, if you know New York, in Union Square. It was really hard to photograph, like down at Ground Zero, and so photographers were kind of pushed up, higher up in Manhattan, and trying to find any visual to represent the story. And a lot of it, you remember, like a lot of photos of like the missing people, the missing posters, which seems so naive now to look at pictures of those posters, because everybody was hopeful that maybe their loved one would be found, and virtually no one was found. But Union Square became kind of like a little vigil, and where people would just gather in these spontaneous just fields of candles.
Candles and all sorts of crazy artwork on the sidewalk, and it was a place for people to gather and sort of grieve in the way that they needed to grieve. And it was interesting because the grief was collective, but it was sort of manifested in all these different ways.
And it just makes you realize that you need a place and for photographers, I mean, I'm making it sound like it was just, a place that we photographed, but it was as much for us to go, and you just need to be around, you need to be around people, and that's what that became. All right,
and you had the interesting story about a print of this image that you delivered.
Yeah, so I was at the White House when Osama bin Laden, not in the White House, but working at the White House when Osama bin Laden was killed, and John Brennan, who I have kind of a conflicted respect for, but when you work around these people, even whether you agree with them politically or not, but with him it's complicated. But I had tremendous respect for him, and I knew that he had spent his the majority of his career on 9/11 and post 9/11 work. And so when bin Laden was killed, I gave him a print of this, and I said, I told him the story about 9/11, and somebody told me recently that it's still hanging in his office. So.
Yeah. So then, it was in 2004, just as the invasion was winding down, you headed off to Iraq. And just talk a little bit about arriving in Iraq at that time and what the scene was like.
I was so utterly unprepared, and Afghanistan, when the invasion in Afghanistan started, I didn't have the experience, and it was a very logistically complicated war to go cover unless you had the weight of a big publication behind you. And I had none of that. So I kind of watched that happen, and I knew, and I was also in Mexico City, like twiddling my thumbs because no one wanted a story out of Latin America. So I sat in Mexico City for about 9 months. But when the invasion to Iraq started to wind up, I knew, I was a little more experienced and had contacts, and I sent myself I bought myself a flak jacket. I went to Jordan and I sat in Amman until the border opened up. So Baghdad had been taken at that point. And then, the weird thing about a war zone is that it's like it can be a free-for-all. It's like the Wild West. So I think it cost me like $500. And I drove in with Guy Raz. I don't know if you guys have ever, the name Guy, but Guy probably doesn't remember who he was in the car with, but Guy and I were like, we shared a car, like we met 2 minutes before the car left. So whenever I hear him on the radio, I'm always just like, someday I'm gonna run into Guy and like remind him that we went into Baghdad together.
Was that the crazy route that would go through the desert?
Yeah. So you could leave at like 11 or 12 at night, and you drive all night, and the drivers have like a tea maker that's plugged into the socket, and they just drink tea all night long, and you just fly through the desert because it's so dangerous. At that point, it was, people weren't robbing people on that road, but it became insanely dangerous.
Yeah, very dangerous. I'll move through to some other images, and maybe this is where we could talk about the images specifically because they bring you to certain times of Iraq. And this is a Shia assassin, right?
Yeah, in this image, although visually, I'd say this use your photographer, visually it's not a strong image, but what is always poignant to me about this image is the time period. As I was saying, it was like a Wild West there, and this was a Hezbollah-trained Shia assassin who was, they were going around executing Ba'ath Party members. So the Ba'ath Party was Saddam Hussein's party, and so Sunnis, and there were these renegade groups that later became what was essentially the Civil War, but they started as little groups of trained guys. He was really young, I can't remember how old he was, but he was a teenager. And they would go around doing these retribution killings that were really like family type things, like I'm not saying this because I can't remember the facts of his case, but like an uncle or something like that, or a father. And that's where the seeds of these, the Civil War really came from. And I remember I was working with a writer, with John Lee Anderson for the New Yorker, and we were interviewing a State Department person, and you could tell that they were just turning a blind eye to it. I mean, not that they could have done anything to stop this, they were so overstretched, but it was like they just kind of had to throw up their hands, and just let these little killings happen,
and then things just sort of devolve from
there.
But
that's where the snowball starts.
Right. And this was a massacre in,
It was in Karbala. There's a huge Shia festival that was not permitted under Saddam, and so after he was toppled, the Shia really were, really embraced their festivals, and this was I think there were like 2 million people in this tiny town, like the size of Camden. I mean, it's tiny, and we were warned that Zarqawi, who was the kind of the offshoot of Al Qaeda that was in charge of the insurgency then, was going to do something, and I'd just gone in. It's kind of similar to your story about Mosul. I'd just come in. I'd been photographing all night long because these festivals are just all night things. And I'd just gone in to rest, and I had, as a woman in a religious place, I was so covered up in, like scarves and my full head to toe black outfit, and I'd taken everything off, and then I heard the bomb go off, and it was pretty far away, but it's just such a distinctive sound, and then I was like, all right, here we go, and I wrapped myself, mummied myself back up again, and I ran outside And as I was running, one of the drivers of my colleague tried to stop me, and I was just like running toward it, and just then, like another one, probably as far as where the projector is, went off, and like blew me back into the glass. And that was pretty much the day. This is like the one frame I got before all of that happened. But it was like 200-something people were killed, and it was like a blip. I mean, I tell the story, and like no one knows what I'm talking about. It was just such a blip of how many people died in that war.
And that happened over and over.
Over and over, yeah.
One of your more harrowing stories from Iraq was, and I don't know if this is the safe house, but when you went to check on this safe house without your driver, right? Or your...
I had the driver with me. Yeah, so this is in Ramadi, which is in the, it's in Anbar province, which is outside of Baghdad, very Sunni, and there was a brief period where you could, as a journalist, you could go out there, but it was very, it was like Saddam's kind of stronghold when he was in power, and the insurgency eventually took it back over. It's gone back and forth. I mean, the Iraqi army has taken it, and it's fallen and taken. So it was a pretty sketchy place, but my bureau, the local bureau manager said there's this house, and that was bombed overnight by American planes, and people are treating it like a shrine, and they're smelling the rubble, and they're taking bags of it and praying in it. And so I went, and this was like the last time I went to that region, and I photographed, and all of a sudden there were fewer and fewer people in the house, and my normal driver wasn't with me. I was with someone I hadn't worked with that much. My normal driver would have picked up on this, and this is where, you know, in war, your entire existence and your work and your life depends on your fixer or your driver. Sometimes it's the same person. And it's a classic case of where, you know, he would have picked up on this, but the guy I was with did not. The house had emptied out, and the next thing I knew, there was this one guy staring at me, and when I really realized it and I looked up at him, he just went like this to me. And it was so dramatic. If the house wasn't empty, I would have thought, okay, this is some little teenager just messing with me. But the house had emptied out for a reason. You know, everybody else knew what was happening. I was the last one to realize it.
Which is not a good place to be in.
No.
So what happened after that? Yeah, that's not a good place to end that story.
I know. I don't want to dwell too much on this on singular pictures, but what happened after that was that I ran out to the car and got in the car, and there weren't mobile phones at the time. It was just a sat phone, which you have to like get the signal like straight.
Right. You gotta have the antenna angled just right.
Yeah, and so I was trying to like fire it up because I was with a writer who had gone next door to interview the neighbors. And, you know, these writers, it's such a pain. And
chasing quotes when things are getting dangerous.
And so I was trying to call him to warn him, and as I was like trying to fire it up, this like shadow came over the window, and it was the same guy, and he had a grenade in his hand. And that's when I was like, all right, let's go. I wasn't as calm as I'm making it sound like, but. And so the driver stepped on it, and that guy followed us until we got to like the town line. He jumped on a motorcycle. And once we got to a town line, I knew we had to get out of, you know, it's all like regional little.
Right. Yeah, he's got a cutoff point.
He's got a cutoff, and they do. And so once we crossed that, he just like fell away. I mean, I didn't know where that line was, but you just drive like hell until you find it.
Nerve-wracking.
Yeah. And it was, you know, I don't think he was really going to kill me, but it was certainly a warning, like journalists didn't go there again. You know, that was when they started to have the run of that province, and it was just you know.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of it, is like knowing where you can and can't go. Yeah,
and Iraq became, you know, the first 2 years that I was there, I traveled the entire country and covered so many things, and then it just got more and more and more condensed where you just couldn't travel anymore.
And one of the really interesting things, you brought up the driver drinking tea on the drive across from Jordan, and this shot is from a tea shop, which I photographed some tea shops in Kurdistan, and boy, they're serious about their Dominoes, and they are way serious about their tea.
Oh yeah.
Like tea is king. And I just, the scenes in the tea shop are like, they're a photographer's dream, really.
Everything takes place there, and it's the subtleties. I mean, I don't, as a woman, I add an element sometimes that's odd, you know. So taking a picture like this, I mean, for any photographer, but a woman in the Middle East can be trickier. You have to wait and wait and wait until everybody stops looking at you.
Yeah.
You know, it's something you got to wait them out. And that kid in the blue was like the last one. And finally, like, somebody opened a door. This is like total shop talk, photographer shop talk.
Yeah.
Someone opened the door and he turned around. I was like, yes.
Yeah.
Finally, he stopped looking at me.
We might resort to shop talk because we know there are photographers in the crowd, but we promise we won't stay on it too long. Just a short story. I was up in Kurdistan, which is much easier as a Westerner to cover. But we were in a tea shop, and I had the same problem. But they wanted me. There was this long line of gentlemen on a bench drinking tea, and they wanted me to come sit with them.
Oh yeah. See, I wouldn't have that problem.
And they wanted someone to take my photo with them. And so I'm like, and this teenager wanders by. The guy grabs my camera, gives it to the teenager, tells me to come sit on the bench, and I'm thinking, I'm never going to see this camera again. That kid's going to go running off. But, and this, I included this because that's one of the things that shocked me about Iraq is Kurdistan is so just beautiful.
Beautiful,
and green and lush, and it's sort of at that time, it was the anomaly to what was heading, you know, everything, the chaos that was going on down south. So technically, Kurdistan is northern Iraq. The Kurds call it Kurdistan because they would like it to be their country, and that's part of the debate that's going on in Iraq. I want to move on to Lebanon just briefly. Because this was your photos from this time. This was 2008?
2006.
2006.
Yeah, it was like a 3-week war. It was a very brief but very violent war.
And it's just, just seems so atrocious. Everything that, you know, I mean, your images just capture the chaos of what's going on at this time.
It was a disheartening conflict to cover because the two sides were so sophisticated at war propaganda, and you were constantly manipulated by both sides of it, Israelis and the Hezbollah, and then the government was somewhere in the middle of it, you know. But you know, you'd walk into a situation and you'd be photographing, and literally children, you know, I photographed dead children, and it happened a ton, so not to diminish that, because that's real. But there'd be the body of a man taken out the back, you know, where like the cameras weren't, because Hezbollah was so sophisticated, they knew that the image that would really stoke compassion was the children, and Israelis are like do the same type, not that type of thing, but same kind of the same kind of odd propaganda where you're constantly trying to get at the truth through two sides that have been in such active conflict for so long that it's a whole like public relations apparatus around them.
Right, which is
it's an odd part of it. I mean, war is war, and it's...
Your images from here, that really struck me in that I not having seen them before, I immediately had empathy with folks. Like, this woman is like, you know, she's probably got everything left that she can carry, and she's just going through a wasteland.
Well, that was a particularly awful situation. I'm blanking on a page. I don't want to say the name because I'm not entirely sure now. But this tiny town, a tiny village, had been bombed so severely that they were stuck, like the roads were impassable. And we were aware that that was happening, but finally there was a 24-hour ceasefire, and so a bunch of journalists went in, and it was horrific because the only people left in that town were elderly and disabled, and they were left behind, and they were severely dehydrated. malnourished somewhat, but dehydration is the bigger issue. And we had to literally carry them out. And that woman was one of the most able-bodied that we saw.
Oh, wow.
And the whole town looked like that.
And this, what mother couldn't empathize with this photo?
This woman was in a similar type village that was, they couldn't get out. Refugees that you know, could were fleeing to the cities. And during the fighting, you couldn't travel. So this 24-hour period, it was like just bumper to bumper traffic of people just getting out of their villages to go to the cities.
And while we're on, I want to take a little bit of a detour, but I'm going to detour here because your younger brother Michael was also in Lebanon at the same time. Mm-hmm. And when I found this out recently, that you had a brother who's a really amazing photographer in his own right, I was like, what are the chances of having two fabulous photographers from the same family?
My poor parents, right?
Yeah. Well, and so I'm really curious, because Michael's work is tremendous. He had tremendous work from Hurricane Katrina. Yeah. Was it something the two of you sort of developed together, or and sort of supported each other, or was it more competitive?
I'd say it's a healthy
competition?
Competition. I wouldn't really define it as competition, but it's funny because we have very different, we're very different people, obviously. But he really flourishes in like in a newsroom situation with like assignments, and he's really, I mean, like what that guy can do with like just a perp walk assignment is just incredible. Like he can take an assignment, and that structure is what really makes him flourish. Whereas if I get into a structure, I shut down, and I'm like, I can't go sit outside that courthouse, like, I don't want to do it. You know, and so like freelancing and the stress of having to come up with your own budget and logistics and buying your own equipment, like that's as stressful as it is, like I can handle that. So we're kind of opposite.
Yeah, good. I'm more in his camp, just by the way.
Most people are.
Give me a structure and I will find the most creative thing that I can get out of that structure. But tell me I have to be my own businessman and sell my photos, I would fall flat completely. Well, that's great. So I know you're all saying, Greg, enough about, you know, conflict zones. We want you to ask her questions about the White House. Isn't it time we got on?
It is always the most popular subject.
But, sorry, before we go there, so, all right, so we've already covered the fact that we were both at 9/11, and we were both in Iraq in 2004. But what you don't know is we covered a story in Maine near the same time. So one of your early stories on Maine adaptive skiing, one of the people you focused on was young Nikolai.
Oh my gosh, do you have an update on him?
I covered Nikolai when he was adopted by the family in Wells, who took him in, and when he went through his surgeries. And I do have enough. I will update you later. He was full of energy. So Nikolai had an operation to straighten his left foot, and he got a prosthetic leg for his right leg, and nothing slowed him down.
It was amazing.
And here he is climbing up to the bunk beds, and he just had that prosthetic on that day. It was his first day of walking with it, and he's climbing a bunk bed ladder. So that's Nikolai. So we both photographed Nikolai.
That's amazing.
That's when I was going through your work.
His family has adopted several kids with various disabilities.
Yeah, through the years, 11 of them.
11?
11. It's the Thomas.
Took them skiing. They'd show up, all of them, and they all needed different things.
Yeah, they adopted 11 kids from various parts of the globe. All had some kind of medical need. Every doctor in Maine, every hospital, free medical, they fixed everybody for free. There was never a cost. And it all started, Chris Tomaszewski was calling, she thought she was calling about some kind of makeup information line, and she had dialed the wrong number, and she got the first adoption agency. And it was a wrong number, and she's like, well, what do you mean? What do they need? And that's led to their first adoption. Amazing, amazing people. Anyway, so.
Oh my gosh, that's so neat.
On to the White House in the Obama administration, which...
Another amazing family.
Yeah, so I'm going to let you tell most of your stories, but the thing that in looking through your images, what really struck me was as the press, we're kept out of the moments in the times that you were able to access, sort of those quiet times between the two of them, or just one of them, and I thought that was really cool. You get to see an insight into, the first family and the President of the United States, which is having that behind the scenes access must have been. You must have got used to it after a while, but at first it must have been like super cool, or maybe it was super cool the entire time.
It was super cool the entire time, and I always had an edge of nervousness, particularly around the president. And I knew if I lost that edge, I was going to make a mistake. And it really is as stressful as you think it is. I mean, everything, your presence in a meeting in the Oval Office, I mean, every time you get up off the floor, you're on the floor, so you're photographing, every move you make, you don't want them to see you. And your whole goal is to do your work without them ever knowing you're there. That's your goal, and you screw that up all the time. And so I always had that edge of fear. I always said awkward things to the president when he would engage. Like sometimes you'd be in the Oval Office like waiting for someone to come in, and it takes them like a minute to bring them in. So there's just a moment where you're just like standing with the president. It's not like you were prepared. Most people, when they meet the president, they know what they're going to, and they have something they're going to say, and half the time it's really stupid. Just if any of you ever get in that situation, everybody says stupid things. But inevitably I was nervous and would say something ridiculous. And but I liked that edge because the office demanded that kind of fear and respect. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be too comfortable.
Right. But having said that, you, I think I read somewhere where you said that Barack Obama and his wife Michelle were no different in the public. Like they were the same people, whether they were having a private moment together or they were in a public outing. And maybe speak to that a little bit.
There wasn't like, and you photograph politicians, you know how it is, like people can be like this, and then like as soon as the camera's off, they change it. And I don't blame them for that. I mean, I would be like that if I was in the public eye. I mean, it's exhausting. But her love of, children or whatever, I mean, it's so cliche, but it's just so true. Like she can't not hug. Like it's just who she is. Like she just has to get in there and do it. And the president loves babies. I mean, it's just like, it's all legitimate. Mm. And he is so smart. And the only thing that I say that's different is that she in particular is so funny. And can be a biting humor that would definitely be misunderstood if it was blown up, especially
right.
In this day and age. And there was such pressure on her that I think even he didn't have, that she had to really check herself in a way that I wish other people could see. And someday you will, and I think it has come out over the years, but she's so smart and so funny that I wish that humor could fly a little bit more.
Right.
Someday.
Right. Yeah, there's got to be a lot of checking that goes on when you're the president or the president's wife. And
the pressure and they probably wouldn't even say this exactly directly, so I'll say it. The pressure on a black man and a black woman in that office is just way above and beyond what any to date what any white president and first lady. I mean, like her choice of everything, every single thing was so scrutinized and criticized in ways that just are absurd. And that's a pressure that every first lady has and every president has. But the pressure on them, they had to be perfect. I mean, they had to be
right.
above and beyond perfect. And even then is not good enough for a lot of people, but it's a different pressure.
Right, and that's to say, I mean, the pressure of being president is, I think we've all seen photos of the president at the beginning of their terms, and then you look at the end and you're like, wow, they look like they've aged 30 years. And I think it's the stress from everything that they've got to think about and decide upon. And
every detail, yeah.
One of the things I loved about your White House photos is that they, in addition to capturing these really sweet private moments, you did sort of also capture some just very, this is a historic moment. He's addressing the UN, right? Was it the Security Council or was it the General Assembly?
I think this was the General Assembly.
But it's just a wonderful photo, like the scope of it. And this is I don't choose favorites. I'm a parent. I don't have favorites. This is one of my favorite photos of yours. This is Michelle Obama with Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And maybe talk a little bit about this moment. Was this one of those times like you're trying to sort of not...
I mean, that's far and away the most nervous I've ever been in my life. We didn't know. I knew when we were going to South Africa that we hoped that she was going to be able to see it. He was very sick at the time, which was not that public. So privately, I knew that if he was having a bad day, we weren't going to see him. And even if she was going to see him, I wasn't necessarily going to go in as well. And she had her kids and her mom with her. So the question was always, we didn't know. And it wasn't until like an hour before that we got the green light and they could bring one staff member in. And this is where, what I love about photography. She could bring one non-family member and the staff chose me to go because that's just the responsibility, the magnitude of that job. So, and they told me before I went in, this is more shop talk, it's really dark in the room, and you're just going to have about 30 seconds. It's just really dark. You're just going to go and snap it and then get out. So I walk in, and it was just like flooded. So I shoot on manual.
Yep. So you're like, I'm up on ISO 6400. And
I was on ISO 6400. I was like way up high, like 30 of us. I mean, I was like prepared for a dungeon, right? I walk in, it's flooded with light, and I'm shaking, like literally, and I'm on like a 30th, so I'm like shaking.
Yeah.
And I also think I'm gonna get kicked out any second. I'm like, just be cool, like be a fly on the wall, don't let them even remember you're here. Because you just wanna maximize your time in a situation like that. And then it just went on and on and on, and then I realized like, oh my gosh, I'm on 30th of a second, and I'm shaking, and so I like spin the dial, I'm like, okay, all right, like, something, and you check it, like, did I get anything in case I get kicked out?
Yeah.
And, it's not my favorite picture from that day, but this is what the White House released, and someday I hope to release the other images because it's not my favorite one, but it was one of my favorite days ever.
This one caught my eye, and it goes back to sort of being there in those quiet times and those moments that the public doesn't see and the press doesn't often see. And this was, I think, just before a radio address, but just sort of him collecting his thoughts, and I think it's really, it's a striking photo.
The story about these images is that, the president, I actually don't even know if President Trump does this, but, there's the weekly address. President Obama turned it into a video address. And we would shoot it every Friday afternoon. And it was always like a point of contention. It was like, why do we do this? It's like his least favorite thing to do because you got to go in and you got to like hit your mark, and it's Friday afternoon, he's exhausted. And so we usually got if he ever was in a bad mood, it was likely this was the moment of the entire week when he'd be like, all right, let's do this. And so the pressure on all of us, like nobody wanted to slow the process down, like the prompter had to be ready. And he's not a difficult, edgy person that way. It's just he's the president. You do not want to be the person that makes him wait.
Right.
So everyone's always just like, you have to be ready. And sometimes we'd sit there for an hour because a meeting wasn't let out yet or whatever. Anyway, but I needed those moments where someone had to cue the prompter because the only way I could take the still image, now they're more silent technology, you can do it more easily, but I would be desperate for a moment when they weren't rolling the camera so that I could click, because this is the Roosevelt room, it's like a tiny room.
Yeah, and that's we were talking about technological advances, it's a major thing in that the click of the shutter on the camera is like our giveaway, and there are times where you just can't make that noise.
You cannot.
And I will say, not to go totally techno here, but I switched to Sony.
I would have killed for a Sony.
Yeah, right,
yeah.
So the deal with the Sonys is the shutter is completely silent because they're mirrorless cameras. There's no mirror that has to flip out of the way, and I can't even begin to tell you how liberating that is.
It is. It's a great camera.
But my coworkers at the Press Herald, they think I'm a Sony salesman because I'm always talking about it.
I don't get paid to say that. I really love that camera.
I love the story behind this photo, so I'll let you tell it. But it was a Cinco de Mayo party, and I just actually ran, I have to imagine, you're a president, you go to a party, everybody wants to talk to you, so...
They don't eat. They don't eat it. And, fundraisers and stuff, like they don't get to eat, like, except when they're like running out the door. And that's what happened there. There was a Cinco de Mayo party on the state floor, and it was time for them to go up. And in fact, he always, whenever he was in town, he always had dinner at 6:30 with his family. It was like a standing thing. Everybody knew. And he might come, oftentimes would come back, but at 6:30, they'd go upstairs. So he literally was going to dinner, and that's why she's giving him a hard time, because they had this beautiful dinner waiting for them upstairs, and yet he grabbed the staging area for the catering, not catering, it's made there, is right by the elevator, and he just like grabbed it in the elevator.
We'll come back to this. This is some immigrant stuff, but because we're at a time where we want to open it to questions from you all. It's not fair for me to get to ask Samantha all the questions. So we actually have 2 microphones set up on either side of the auditorium. They're about a third of the way up. And if you can make your way to one of those microphones, if you can't make it to the microphone, just put your hand up or give a holler. We could have someone run the microphone to you. Glenn, what do you want?
What happened to the writer?
Glenn.
Who does he work for now? He works for the LA Times. He's safe. His driver, this is actually a good question, because his driver was Sunni. And his driver, they wouldn't have touched him. His name's Brian. They wouldn't have touched Brian because his driver was just connected enough. There's a fine line where you want to have somebody that's, not going to be a target, but you don't want anyone who's complicit in violence. So in Iraq in particular, the line was, you crossed it and all the time unknowingly. Yeah. But that's the story of the writer.
And of course, Glenn's a writer at the paper, so that's why he's so concerned what happened to the writer.
The writer's fine.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Thank you. What are your 3 favorite images that have not been published? Because I do it for a living too, so I'm just curious, like the ones that you've never put out that are your favorites.
It would be stuff from the White House, and someday I will. But stuff with the kids, because it was just such a special thing to see them as parents. And I traveled during my first summer working there. I traveled a lot with Mrs. Obama and the girls. And we'd go to museums, and she was like a history teacher, teaching them, about art and history. And I, as a mother now, I think of that all the time, about how she would use a vacation and summer and a weekend trip as a teachable moment. Constantly, she was teaching them constantly. And I haven't seen them in a long time, but they, are lovely girls and so smart and curious. And so probably images like family, those intimate images, which I understand at the time, they were such little girls that they didn't release very much stuff with the family, and I didn't have control over what was released.
And how does that work? Did they control the release of everything that you photographed while you were there? Like, do you have any freedom to to not publish, but use anything that you photographed without?
No, it would have to be cleared.
Okay.
Which once the library opens, that will probably be an easier process. But right now, I would contact them and ask if I can show it, and someday I'll do a book, and you don't want to use that up.
Right. You don't want to play that card.
One act.
Yeah. You don't want to do that.
You don't want to do it like image by image.
Right. Next.
Hi. So a lot of your coverage is very emotional, and you're going through very traumatic moments. How do you take care of yourself?
It's this is cliche, but it really is true. You remove yourself in a way that like a surgeon would, and I couldn't do it. A lot of the stuff I couldn't do now. Part of it is just having built up a lot of metaphorically scar tissue from it, and being a parent, like I couldn't do it now. So I kind of, when people ask me that question, I relate to the question because I look and I'm like, how did you do that? Like, I understand it, and I still can't really explain it. I had, wasn't that I wasn't fearful, but I had a capacity for that very particular kind of stress that war causes, and I was able to do it then, and I understood I had a job, and if you became emotional about it, it's very dangerous. So you'd have to leave if you got emotional about it.
Right, and the same with fear. I felt in my time in Iraq, I found I had to be okay with the fact that I might die.
Yeah.
Which sounds ridiculous, but you actually have to get yourself to that point. Like, because if you're thinking about that all the time, then your mind is not where your mind needs to be.
And I did one trip that was about a month long, and I was just, I entered it in the wrong state of mind, and the entire month I was a danger to myself because I was scared, and I thought about it, and I needed to get out, and it was not, and I went back again later, and it was fine, but that trip, it just, I knew I had to remove myself from it, you know.
The third time the paper asked me to go back to Iraq, my daughter was 10 months old on the first trip and a little over a year on the second. But the third trip, she was 3, and I was sitting on the couch and I was reading her a book, and I had told them, give me a few days to think about it. And there was a way she looked at me, and I was just like, I can't do it.
Yeah.
So like, if I don't come back now, there'll be a hole there because she will remember.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do it. And I didn't. Next.
So, having just heard what both of you said, how do you deal with, either emotionally or cognitively, that you're there for a month and they're there forever?
That's hands down the hardest part, because you can leave and you can't get caught up in it, because it's a responsibility, but you owe it to them to take those stories and bring them back to the larger world, and that's where like the ego gets involved sometimes to dangerous levels, because you can come in and out and you're telling their story, but it's very hard. I've spoken about the black and white image of the little boy, and that realization is very powerful when you think about the people you're leaving behind, and there's a lot of wreckage behind in Iraq. I don't know anybody alive in Iraq anymore. They either died or fled. I mean, I don't think I know a single person there, and I knew hundreds. I had hundreds of people that
Yeah.
I saw every time I went, and not a single one is alive or living there anymore.
And that, I think your question goes to the dilemma that photojournalists, whether they cover conflicts overseas or not, that they deal with every day, is how involved do you get with the story, and how do you stay objective when you're in situations that are so awful that you want to put down your cameras and help. But it's another mindset I think photojournalists get into, is that we believe in what we're doing, and we believe if we take the photos and we get them to a larger audience, that's how we try to enable some kind of change. And it doesn't always work, but that's sort of the paradigm that you sometimes work off of.
And I get this question all the time of, like, do you ever want to like put it down and help somebody? Of course, and you do all the time. That picture of the woman carrying the bags, I didn't take that many pictures that day because we literally spent hours helping them. It's just common sense, and but there are other moments where somebody is grieving or in pain or whatever. And I'm not the one equipped to take care of that person. Like, you give them water, you help where you can, but if you picked up every person that needed your help and took them to a hospital, you'd be saving one person, but you wouldn't be telling the story. And there are people in war, believe it or not, come out of nowhere, and an ambulance shows up, and these people, I mean, it's incredible what they do, but there are systems in place. Even in war, there are systems in place to do those things. So, this idea that we're sitting there watching it and then walking away is, I've maybe seen it once or twice where someone did that, and they were shunned from the tribe of photojournalism.
Yeah.
No one wants to work with that person.
I don't know of anyone, any photojournalist who isn't a human being first and a photojournalist second.
You wouldn't, you couldn't do it. You know, you
Yeah.
just couldn't.
I was just wondering, in those really short moments or those important moments where you have to get the photograph, is there a process of grounding that you go through? You step into 9/11 and it's overwhelming emotionally, visually, and where's the starting process? Is it, do you ground yourself and then say, okay, it's time to proceed?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, sometimes you literally have to say it almost out loud. Like with Mandela, I really had to be like, okay, this is like the most important person you will ever meet. Like, here you go. And I never in a million years thought I was going to photograph him because he was, you know, by the time I came into this career, I just never thought I would. So that's a moment of like grounding, which isn't quite what you're talking about, but it's an emotional thing where you have to ground yourself. Every story is different. Sometimes you know your time may be limited and you shoot like crazy and then you ground yourself. So it's like you got to just get something in case you're kicked out. And then if you have time, then you think about it more. You get, you know, greater depth. You take your time with it. You try different things. So it's like a layered approach.
Right, because if it had panned out to be that 30 seconds is all you got, that's, I think we go into that mode of like, we get really nervous and we're just like casting a wide net, you know, like we're trying to get something because our time's going to be limited. And those are like the most stressful.
So stressful.
Yeah.
Hi. I was thinking about that photograph in Vietnam where the guy's about to be shot in the head. Do you have a moment like that?
The closest thing to that is the guy, the body that was being carried. He died. I swear to God, and I've never shown this. And I don't know if it would even show up to other people, but I have a frame of him, and I'm pretty sure he's alive, and then he's dead. And I know he ultimately died. I don't know if he passed out or if he died in that moment. But my instinct is that I literally watched it happen. And they were carrying him to a mosque. When the bombing happened, they were bringing all the wounded into a mosque there. And they took him into the mosque, and then they shut the doors. And then a mob formed, and I couldn't follow him in. But someone later told me he had died. But that's like that. I mean, I didn't have any control over it. There's nothing I could have done to help him. There were medics working. You could see carrying him. But that was a haunting thing. And you know, he's looking at me.
Next.
As the mother of a beautiful little 5-year-old daughter, who's my goddaughter, is there a moment that stands out in your career that strikes you as the most profound as a mother now?
I think about all the time, you know, when we complain about like the work involved in being a mother. I had no idea how much work was involved in being a mother. I mean, I love every minute of it, but it's a lot. And when I want to complain or think about that, I think about the women that have had to carry their babies, you know, immigrant mothers, Syrian mothers, carry their children, my daughter's size, hundreds of miles. And you know how it is when like, oh, I haven't gone to the grocery store. Like, imagine you literally don't know where your child's next teaspoon of water is coming from. And in a way, that's part maybe why I don't know if I could do the more dramatic stuff that I did, because I have that, I now have that in common with them of motherhood. So in that way, you know, I think about those moms all the time.
I just want to check in, Bob. We have time for couple more questions. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I don't know too much about photojournalism. The extent of my photography knowledge is on my old iPhone 4S. But I do remember seeing a movie a few years ago called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And one thing that the photojournalist character in it mentioned was that sometimes there are moments so special and so sacred that you choose not to take the photo. Are there moments you can think back on in your career that when you decided not to take the photo?
Not when I'm in a professional mode, but my friends and family are really annoyed with me because I don't take pictures like at parties and like in social situations that much. Instagram has changed that a little bit, but my family in particular is like, why, you know, or I'll take a picture and I won't give it to them, and they'll be like, remember that picture you took like a month ago? Like, when are you going to give that to me? It's like, technology does help with that. You can airdrop it now, but like before that, like the last thing I want to do is go like archive, because I can't just give you the photo. I have to like label it, archive it, Photoshop it, you know, make it look good, caption it. It's like, to me, that's work. And so when I'm just hanging out with my friends, like, I don't particularly love shooting because I'm like, I'm in the moment. And if I get into that professional mode, then I'm just like, okay, tilt your head up and do this. And, you know, like, the portrait of you is going to be perfect just like this. And
yeah,
it's exhausting.
I think it'd be the same in professional mode. That's like, we're there to document. So I was racking my brain to come up with a time where I said no. But I do think, you know, I've been, you know, maybe out hiking with my kids or something where we'll come across, you know, we'll be hiking and there'll be some stunning moment in the mountains, and I'll choose not to photograph that and instead, you know, talk with them about it and sort of point out stuff and sort of, rather than document it and then carry it home later, live in that moment and sort of like make it a teachable moment for them.
And if you guys ever do meet a politician or celebrity you admire or whatever, it's amazing to me how people, and I know they regret this. They are so fixated on taking a picture or selfies, like, you know, that's a whole other thing. But they're so fixated on it. And I watch people over and over. Can I pick up your phone?
Yes.
And so, like, you're Barack Obama, and they're looking at the phone, and they're like, he's putting his hand out, and they miss it, and his hand is going to be there for 2 seconds.
Yeah.
And they miss it, and I see they don't even know they missed it. They missed a chance to shake his hand and look him in the eye. Instead, they get a crappy, blurry photo of him looking at someone else.
Yeah.
I saw it over and over again. So if you ever get the chance to meet someone you admire like that, someone else will get the photo.
That's right.
Have your friend get the photo. You just concentrate on that person. You'll thank me for it.
It's good advice. I've seen like any politician event that's like, you know, where a national politician, they're just, if they sweep the crowd, the hands are out, the phones are out.
And they'll appreciate it.
Yeah. Last question.
Thank you for this wonderful evening. I wonder whether you could tell us how the Obama job came about.
I covered, well, the first time I met him, it was 2004. I was coming back from Iraq, and my editor at Time Magazine, it was that trip, actually, that I had that terrible month. And my editor at Time knew I'd had a terrible month, and I was flying back, and she said, can you just change planes at JFK and go to Chicago? Because there's this, you know, great new politician. He'd just given his convention speech, 2004, so he was already somewhat known. But can you go to Chicago? And I was so jaded. I was like, oh my gosh, last thing I want to do is photograph a politician. And I went, and of course, like just immediately, you know, recognized what he was. And then, long story short, I, you know, kept up with him somewhat and photographed him in New Hampshire for photographers in the crowd. You know, New Hampshire is right there, and as these primaries heat up, you can go to events, and you know, there were events where I was the only photographer there, and you have such incredible access that is gone within 6 months. That access is gone, but you can go and as voters, you know, take that chance. Just show up at these events in New Hampshire. They're really beautiful, and it is democracy in action, and it's a very earnest thing, and I highly recommend it. So they got to know me that way, because I just would every time he was in New Hampshire, I'd show up, and then when they were looking for photographers, I really wanted to be the head photographer, but they gave that to Pete, and then so I got a call asking to be one of the other three.
Thank you for that question. That was one of the questions on the list that I forgot at the office. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you for coming up from Boston.
I just want to make one quick little plug for a second. Because I'm in this very heady space about journalism right now, doing this fellowship. Local newspapers need your support. The photography departments need your support. I think that the breakdown in news it started with small city newspapers being gutted. So it's really important to support them in more ways. It's not just about subscribing and reading but encourage those stories. Help the photographers and writers come up with good dynamic stories. It's a really great community resource that Portland has.
Yeah, thank you. I would concur that when local news disappears, that we're in real trouble. Yep. So, but yeah, I can speak on behalf of the entire Press Herald staff. Every one of us works incredibly hard, and we love what we do. And we don't do it for us. We do it for the readers and the subscribers. So, yeah, thanks for that plug.
It's sincere.
All right, thank you, everyone.